Hey, fellow G and Tears, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are doing this series on the psychology of cults, social psychology stuff. It's kind of our way of responding to what's happening in our land of liberty here in the United States, right? And so if you want to go check out previous episodes about that, we're doing a lot on conformity. And we got to one of the major sort of social psych experiments on conformity, which is the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment that we'll talk y'all through. And if you're familiar with it, we'll give our own like kind of 2 cents of what we think it's about in regards to we're doing this kind of on multiple levels, right, Daniel? On the one hand, we're talking about what's happening now, that it seems like there's so much like cult psychology dominating our culture here in the United States.
Hmm.
But also it's sort of a commentary on like the risks of cult psychology overall. So we've been doing a bunch of episodes around
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
And I mean, it's also a continuation of a discussion that we've been having on conditioning
Yeah.
for off and on for years at this point. It's just this has been kind of like a very pointed, focused kind of attack, if you will, or dissertation on that from current events, if you will.
Yeah. It's kind of our way of trying to respond to, because we're an educational psychospiritual podcast,
Hmm.
as we talked about in previous episodes, not a news of the day thing, but you know, we're hopefully adding to the conversation, help people figure out what's
Yeah.
happening,
Yeah.
that shit stuff that's going on in the world. So, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting for me researching it, right? I mean, going back and looking at the social psychology, that does relate back to my experience, what I was doing back in undergrad, but also going through and like learning new things about this has been, you know, it's been kind of an interesting little journey for me on a personal level, right? I'm learning a lot, so hopefully other people will learn things too.
Hmm.
All right. And as far as being stuck under the thrall of evil forces,
Oh, yes.
help us get out from under the algorithm.
Yes.
Like, subscribe, do all the things, and you know, it helps people out. So
Yeah.
you've heard it a million times. Anytime you watch one of these things, we just did it again, a million and one. But thank you all for listening. All right, Stanford Prison Experiment, or what's sometimes called the Zimbardo experiment. You know, the main idea in this is really kind of interesting, and it does fit into our wheelhouse of what we like to talk about so much, because it's really about what they'll sometimes call the dispositional hypothesis or the situational one. Are people more kind of, is it more that people are individually psychologically inclined to behave in certain ways, or is it more like you put people under certain social situations and it will tend to elicit those behaviors more so than it
Mm.
be something about this particular person's disposition or something?
Mm.
So I mean, that's kind of a key, I think, point in our whole podcast, like over all of these years we've been doing it, right? Kind of asking that kind of question like you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the attitude to something like this is definitely like situational. For what we're doing with trying to talk about like cult psychology overall, we're doing stuff on conformity. We'll probably also do social psych stuff on obedience and persuasion a little bit at the end. But the other
Hmm.
big things were sort of sociology things, and I've been doing my little research around this to remind myself of these issues. And you know, there's this famous like sociologist, Emil Durkheim, and he talks about this idea of what he calls social facts, which is you put people in social situations and they kind of are almost like the laws of nature, right? You put something, you know, you you shoot a billiard ball and it's going to follow Newton's laws. It's just going to do it, right? And that's kind of how they think about these things. A lot of this stuff that we would more be inclined to say, well, that's something about this individual person. No, it's much more like the social facts, you
Mm.
know, grooves that are there in the social system that just elicit certain behaviors from people. That's kind of the big idea behind this. So the Stanford prison experiment, or the Zimbardo experiment, I think partially it comes from the point of view of really questions about prisons. I mean, they were wondering about that, but it
Right.
ends up opening up this whole other massive set of questions once you do it, where you realize, well, this is asking something really deep about, you know, sociology, psychology, and what do you make out of that, right? Yeah. So is it like, you know, they were asking the question like, is it something in the guards, you know, that leads to problems of abuse, right? Or is it more
Mm.
something where the situation, the structure is just eliciting out, like, you know, you shoot a billiard ball and it goes a certain way on the table. You can't exactly blame the billiard ball, right? You
Right.
shoot, you shoot a you do a putt on the putting green and it rolls a certain way, you don't get mad at the ball. It's just following the green. So,
Guns don't kill people, Eric. People do.
well, you put a bunch of guns everywhere. What's to say? As far as the and like maybe we'll do it at the end, but as far as locally what's happening, we can talk a little bit maybe about, not a news of the day thing, but there's weird shit happening amongst like how people are being taken off the street in the United States, and met some interesting questions maybe at the end.
Yeah.
If you want to follow along to the end, you can hear our opinions about that too a little bit. Because it's ironic because it does fit, right? We're
Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
questions. Yeah, it's like right in the wheelhouse. I just
Hmm.
noticed that today because I was listening to some stuff about it and I was like, oh man, this is like right on time for what we're talking about.
Hmm.
And end of April 2025. Like so like here's how the experiment, sorry, I'll go over the experiment, right? Unless
Yeah.
you got
Yeah.
more intro stuff you want to talk about or
No, no, no. That's good.
okay. So the interesting thing about this was as far as the dispositional thing, is there something wrong with the people? They just grabbed a bunch of like middle class male students kind of things, right? It was like
Mm.
typical of what would happen, They put up their ads like normal kind of psych experiments you'd have
Hmm.
in any university, and they just got the people in. And there, it was randomized over the groups that they're going to put the people in. So there really wasn't anything about these folks that were particularly one way or another, because you might wonder about those kinds of questions. Obvious thing to wonder about. And it was
Mm.
just normal, right? To do it like anything else. It was just a kind of a random selection of just people who signed up to do an experiment,
Hmm.
you know, for a university setting, right, at Stanford. Now, what I didn't know about it when I went back and looked at it again is they really made the thing very realistic. I had studied it back in the day, but you don't remember all the details. So they really, with the prisoners, they really treated them like the whole way through. So once you signed up, you went through like an arrest experience, like they arrested you at your house or something, right? So they just grabbed you and just took you.
Now,
So it's
were the
what's
how
happening now, but you
what was
sign
the
up and
size?
agree to it.
What was the size of the what was the n number for this?
You know what? I don't know if shit, I didn't write it down. I don't think it was in the text that I look at. You can peek it if you want,
Yeah,
right?
I think yeah, I don't know. I mean, it
It
might have
wasn't
been like
huge, 25, 30 people, you'd imagine, something like that.
yeah. And the but were the guards so we should just explain the experiment a little bit because so that we're,
Yeah, we're walking through it kind of like it's like a
yeah.
story. So you got
Yeah.
assigned randomly either to a guard group or a prison group
Yeah.
for the context of the experiment. Again, with no reason, it was randomized. You just get put in one group or another. And then the people who were in the prison group, they did a whole thing of like arresting them and then taking them into the prison setting. So they were like recreating this experience of being in prison, being arrested, and so on. And so, I mean, I didn't remember it was so detailed, but they stripped them, they loused them, they made them sort of just stand around. Imagine like kind of naked, just standing there waiting to get kind of put into groups. They ended up having to wear like identification numbers. They put like the chains on their feet, so they locked them up. They put them in uniforms, and eventually they were just going to go through this whole experience of what it's like to be a prisoner. And that included things. The most notorious thing about this experiment that like skipped through to the end of it is that they had to call it off early because the thing
Yeah.
went so out of control. The abuse in the environment got so crazy. The abuse of the guards towards the prisoners just like was so bad they had to like shut it down before
It
things.
lasted 6 days.
Yeah, it was super short.
Yeah, so it was, I looked it up. It was 24.
Okay, something like that. Yep, that's
Yeah.
about the range. Yeah.
And it was
Uh,
like even number of guards and prisoners actually.
yeah, they it wasn't like there was a big like division of like power between one
Yeah.
side and the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that makes a difference. I don't know, but so there was no. What happened as it went along was that they were sort of warned ahead of time the people in the prisoner group that they were going to lose privacy, right? But eventually degenerated into these different kinds of abuse. Um, hmm. And so, it was that, they realized certain things, like they realized they'd have to have public permission to go to the bathroom. All these things would be really super monitored and controlled. But of course, you don't know you're stepping into a situation where there's
Right.
other rando people are going to start abusing you. The interesting thing on the guard side is they got training a little bit and they got uniforms. The commentary on this part in the social psych literature is this was all sort of like a de-individuation experience. So you went through and you were like put into groups in this random way, and then you went
Hmm.
through these experiences that would happen within these groups, and it was sort of people talk about sort of this loss of personal identity within this window, right?
Yeah.
So then the patterns of abuse just started to escalate and escalate. Um,
As did the rebellion.
well, no, it went weird. So the prisoners initially resisted,
Okay.
but as the punishments got more and more severe from the guard side, they eventually like just collapsed and they
Mm,
conformed. So, I mean, that's part of the reason this is discussed about in terms of conformity, I guess, under threat, right?
mm-hmm.
But they initially sort of resisted, is the way it's talked about, but again, as the punishments sort of escalated, they conformed. And it reminded me a little bit of another kind of classic psych thing, which I thought was worthwhile bringing up here, which is this idea of like learned helplessness. Did you ever study that in your life, Daniel? That ring a bell at all, that term?
No,
Okay.
no, but it sounds a little bit like Stockholm syndrome or something like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's really interesting. So this was sort of like I got it in like behaviorism studies back when I was an undergrad. And
Mm,
it's one of the ones that always stuck with me because it was so wild to like, imagine how it works. So it was really things that were done to dogs. So if you're a dog lover, you might want to like fast forward through this part.
mm,
That kind of dogs. But what they did was they put dogs in these cages, and what they would do is sort of a behaviorist thing, conditioning experiments, right?
mm-hmm.
So what they did was they had the door closed on the cage, and they would like give shocks through the floor of the
Yeah.
cage, and then the dogs would try to get out the door, but the door was locked. And so eventually, what happened was the dogs learned this helplessness, and so even when you open the door up, when you would shock the dogs, even though they could see that the door was open, they'd still just sit in the cage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So eventually, I think it reminded me of it because it seems that's what happened to these prisoners. They initially started to resist, but eventually, as resistance became, you know,
Futile.
futile, yeah, they eventually just like got learned helplessness. Then they just decided, okay, and they just started to like conform, right, to what was being demanded of them.
Mm,
And then the other part of it, which I didn't totally remember that either. I had the same gut reaction you did. I thought they got more and more wild from the prisoner side, but that, when I went back and looked at it again, I was like, oh no, they didn't. They collapsed.
mm.
Yeah, and they took on the learned helplessness thing. The learned helpless thing has always been super profound to me. I think it even came up in a previous episode. There's the great quote that goes back to Confucius for our Asian cultural roots on this episode, where he says, "The way out is through the door. How come no one uses that method?" Well,
Yeah.
it's quote, but like if you learn that there's no way out, even when the door opens, you might just sit there, which I think says something about not dispositional things, but situational things.
Mm,
People will again to feel like, okay, I tried for a while. And even if an opportunity does appear, maybe you don't find your way out.
right.
Because you watch people and you wonder, why can't this person get out the door? How come they don't use that method? And then you start to realize, oh no, they probably learned there was no way out at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just stay stuck wherever they are, which again, it's a profound observation. Yeah. The flip side, and this is the social role aspect, was the prisoners were in their situation, but the guards got more and more abusive, and they started to exercise more and more kind of bizarre authority. So they would sleep deprive them. They would do other kinds of weird stuff,
Mm, yeah, strip them down and
strip them
put them
down,
in solitary confinement and
yeah, spy on them, and like, yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah. And they would start to do it even in ways that were apparently sort of like unprovoked. So just sort of like this abuse of power just started to escalate, which is so striking, of course, in the experiment. This is why this is one of the classics for sure, because it was all just like rando people,
Right.
you know? Um, and kind of the part at the end was this idea of
And
even when
Eric, the people were not like they didn't sign up saying I want to be a guard. They just signed up for the experiment and then it was
yeah,
selected as to who was guard and who was so for people who are listening, it's not like someone's like, oh well maybe somebody was like, ooh, I want to be a guard. I'm a sadistic person and I want to, take revenge for my childhood out on a helpless, experimentee.
yeah,
It's not that. They were all selected. I remember that, they were
yeah,
just chosen.
that's the crux of the whole thing, because sometimes you do wonder about that. These are people who are dispositionally
Yeah.
disposed to
Mm-hmm.
want to be assholes to other people or
Hmm.
something.
Right,
That's
right.
not the thing. It's just, okay, we took you randomly, put them in these different groups, and all of a sudden the social facts thing, that phrase is sticking with me a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the social facts of the situation, and it'll start to elicit naturally these behaviors out of people. It's bizarre. And it was strange in the end because I guess, again, I hit some social psych literature around this, but at the end, when they closed the whole thing down, which they had to, because they were like, this is getting out of control. We got to stop this thing.
Yeah.
Right. Um, the people who were from the guard side were apparently initial reactions were that they were kind of sad to see that the experiment was over.
Mm.
The role was kind of appealing on some level, tapped into something kind of dark, which again is bizarre. The follow up is interesting in that by the end of it, everyone like sort of returned back to normal. They did do what they're supposed to do in a psych setting. They reevaluated the people later on, and everyone seemed they just went back to their life as per usual, which is also striking.
Right.
You know, you go through this like bizarre thing. I don't know. I didn't even know what I would feel about that.
Yeah.
Would you want to see that side of yourself? I don't know, but people did go back to normal apparently. But it's a controversial one in terms of ethics too in the psych world, obviously, right? Because that's
Hmm.
and but I don't think that'd be the fault of even like the experimenter when I think about that. Would you expect this shit to go off the rails in 6 days? I wouldn't have
Not that quick.
anticipated going in just
Do
with some
you know
random.
how long it was set up for, Eric? Do you know how long the experiment was supposed to be? Was it supposed to be like a
Oh,
2 week or?
it's a good question. I don't know. It's notorious for getting shut down early, but I actually don't know what their goal was.
Hmm.
Doing a little research on this as we're talking. So
Yeah.
yeah. So the interpretation in terms of what we've been trying to talk about is the
Yeah.
power of conformity relative to like social roles, which is a big subject matter on the podcast for sure.
Hmm.
Podcast. That was from our old introduction music, the podcast. Um, all right. So, this whole idea of like conformity being elicited by putting people in the social roles, you
Yeah,
know?
Eric, 2 weeks. I looked. 2 weeks.
Okay. Yeah. That seemed about right. That seemed intuitively right, didn't it? You're kind of like, okay, let's,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so anyways, it raises this really like, like I think is an incredibly intense psychospiritual question that we talk about in different ways from different angles, but how you elicit conformity in this situation. In the previous stuff we looked at, it was more sort of the immediate social pressures of will you change an answer to a question, or does it change the way you cognitively experience the world? We have previous episodes on these things. If you just happen into this one, we did
Hmm.
so it's around other social psych stuff around conformity. Um, but this is more like social role as a power of conformity, which is kind of like an intense thing, to
Yeah.
think about, like how strong that is for people, right? Because once you define the role, people will tend to like go into the role as the interpretation, and then I think it's an accurate one, right?
Yeah.
And it has that like kind of psychospiritual power. In the Yeah, I kind of got like a social psych kind of textbook out, and they had a quote from the great philosopher Bertrand Russell that I guess that I'll throw out as part of this too. But it's even different. So he says conventional people are aroused to frenzy by departure from convention, largely because they regard such departure as criticisms of themselves. Okay. So, but the thing is, he uses this phrase conventional people. I think the other way to frame that would be like conventional roles.
Mm.
Once you're in a conventional role, well, then you have more the risk of becoming a conventional person. And then once that gets established, then people tend to be defensive of like their own roles or something, you know.
Yeah, it's like guarding a territory you don't even really want, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So I couldn't help thinking about like, of the things that we talk about a lot, if you have the role of wife or husband or father or mother or employee, let's say,
Hmm.
employer, what's the risk of just like taking on some kind of way of handling situations just because that role is sort of defined, right? And all of a sudden you just fall into the demands of that role without even totally realizing, the power of what you're involved with because those roles are so strong. Is that how you sort of think about this thing too?
Yeah, that's an interesting it's an interesting thought. I mean, I guess my mind is going a little bit even more expansive in terms of when we say roles, I'll say like participation in a particular ideological gathering.
So we're
So,
more to the culty aspect of it.
yeah, so you're we'll just we always you're a Christian, you're a Democrat, you're a conservative, you're a whatever. doesn't like I think it can expand beyond the familial or the labor, you know, the economic side of it into incorporating yourself into any tribe that you find yourself in.
Or any role you take on within like the demands of that tribe or something, right? Like you're taking on a role when you enter into a tribe, you're taking on a part.
Right, but again, I guess I'm thinking of even just participation in a particular ideology itself. There's
Hmm.
not necessarily, at least from my in my way I'm hearing it now, like there's not necessarily a role. So if you go to, we'll do both, right? If you go to if you're a MAGA person, like what's your role in that? You don't have necessarily a role. I guess your role is, to buy shit that he sells you, you know what I mean? And be happy about it, right? Although that shit's going to get more expensive now that imports stuff coming from China. So, but no, so there's that, but you don't really have a
No, Daniel,
role.
there's going to be factories all over the United
Oh,
States
sorry.
making red caps.
Sorry, I didn't realize. Um, but then the same thing. If you're a more liberal-minded person and you're going to a Bernie and AOC rally, okay, like you don't have you're a promoter of their beliefs and whatnot, but I don't know that you have necessarily have a role. So, but you're still probably have some pressure to fall in line when talking about that thing. You're going to be less likely to criticize,
Mhm.
even if you're not necessarily totally in line. And I think that is probably one of our, and it's definitely from our previous episode, that's our biggest complaint. It's
Yeah,
like you're being ideological, ideologically untrue. You're maybe consciously participating in cognitive dissonant behavior in not expressing who you are at the behest of other people's pressure, number one, or two, unable or unwilling to give honest critique of the greater powers that you are more closely aligned with, even if you know in your heart of hearts, like, I'm gonna give him a pass again for the 15th time on this one issue. Don't worry, it'll come around. Like, no, that doesn't fit. So when you say that there's a pressure in a role, I could say that there's a pressure in even being closely associated.
yeah, like two things kind of pop up as a follow-up episode to this one, foreshadowing of future episodes. We're going to be doing one on dissent, right? What does it mean
Mm,
to have dissent and who are the people? Like the psychology of dissent will be one
mm,
of the episodes we'll do, right?
mm-hmm.
And then maybe we'll double up back and we'll look more at things like obedience and persuasion. But like the
Yeah,
dissent we'll do, right?
yeah.
Before we move on to other parts of this kind of big discussion we're doing on this danger of like a certain kind of psychology. Like, I mean, that's it says this in this thing too. There's nothing special about these dudes who are in this experiment. They're
Right.
just average bros who were just taken out of this, campus setting from this, from around this town, right?
Mm-hmm.
Palo Alto or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just people from that, from that place. There was nothing unique about them in terms of who they were, right? And I suppose you can say when you join a group, the same way you might join the group of prisoners or the group of guards, then you're joining like something where you're going to take on some kind of role some way or another. I guess if you want to expand the idea, and it matches what you're saying to my mind, right?
So as
You identify
somebody,
as MAGA, you start identifying as that, or you identify as whoever you are from a different political perspective. You're taking on kind of a thing, right?
well, let me tell you, there is something very powerful about a uniform.
Yeah.
And there is something very cohesive about being dressed identical to the person next to you.
Yeah.
Because the only thing that's different is on the outside is just your face,
I mean,
which
you
is
went through that experience in the military. How did that
absolutely.
feel? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it gives you a strong bond between you and the person next to you. On the whole, obviously individual differences, between people, but on the whole, those are people that are on quote unquote your team, and now you know it. How do you know it? Well, because they're dressed the same as you. You're, as they like to say where I'm from, Eric, matchy matchy.
Well, I was thinking like if you're part of this experiment and you're on the guard side, I'm sure you're shooting the shit about what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're discussing how you're handling things. Oh, this guy's a particular fucking difficult person over here. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, I'm treating him like this. Maybe you can do the same. Like I'm
Hmm.
sure you're talking all kinds of stuff,
Yeah, they were
right?
working 8-hour shifts.
Yeah.
So they were on 24 hours.
Yeah.
8 hours, 8 on, 16 off, three, three guards at a time,
Hmm.
nine, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Um, so they're definitely coordinating.
Yeah. And they're talking, right? You're developing a certain sense of like camaraderie around the role or something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're dressed the same as you. So those
Yeah.
people they're on your team, you
Yeah.
know? It's like people who look like you or speak the same language as you or from the same town or whatever. They are, that's the in group. And so what are you willing to do to protect that in group? Apparently very dastardly things, even on a psych experiment at
Yes.
Stanford.
Yeah. Which is the power of like, yeah, the power of like group identity and social role.
Hmm.
It fits into the cult thing for sure, right? Because the minute
Yeah.
you're there, you're going to take up some role within the context of whatever that group is, right? Now I have a
Hmm.
role as a member of this group.
Hmm.
Even it's more informal, like I'm a member of MAG or I'm a member of like whatever you want to do on the left side that might be equivalent, you know?
There
You
is
can,
none, but
okay, yeah, there's nothing quite equivalent. I was trying to be polite.
yeah, well,
But when you look at it, it's kind of like, okay, you're taking on something. And you're right, there's an ideology behind that you're
yeah.
engaged in and so on. I have like in this experiment, it's always struck me, and this is obviously such an important part of how I think about psychospiritual development too, is like I was talking with someone about this today over brunch, just the whole idea of like because I was talking about this episode that we were going to do, and just the whole idea that like you could look at like a whole society then as being defined by these roles, and the
Mm,
minute you enter into them, now you're taking on a whole thing. It's not as dramatic as being a prisoner and a guard. Maybe those are pretty dramatic roles, but
right.
that's one of the implications of the experiment, which is why I brought about like there's a role called wife, there's a role called husband,
Mm,
a role called father, mother, daughter, son, employer, employee, those are all roles that will start
mm,
to have definitions behind them. And I
mm,
guess that's the power of like social facts too. I'm like, that phrase. I believe that in my heart of hearts. I think this is true. From like a Taoist point of view or a tantric point of view, as we talked about this before. But I think, where I first got exposed to these things on a personal level was like studying this social psychology and just being like, shit, look how powerful this is, right? And for me, like in trying to understand my world, even going back to when I was an undergrad before I started doing Zen, which was my big spiritual first
yeah.
initiation thing,
Yeah.
I was like, well, I better understand some sociology and some anthropology if these
Mm,
roles are so strong.
mm,
And I think that's what we're trying to do in this podcast, share some of those experiences, right?
yeah.
What it's like to kind of like see how these ideas stretch across like multiple fields. All of a sudden, it's like all over the place. I've
Hmm.
had pretty deep conversations with people that I deeply love and care about, where I tried to make the point like, if you start taking on this particular role, whatever that would be, husband, you take on the role of like father or something, and you don't differentiate yourself from that role, those roles tend to have a lot of like baggage along with them,
Mm,
right? And we had kind of interesting conversation with the person I was talking with today, because ultimately her point was, well, if you're in the midst of all of this, it's pretty hard to be free. And I was like, yeah, it works against psychospiritual freedom, right? You're
hmm.
so confined into whatever that particular thing is. And this, of course, is like, it's not like these are Stanford undergrads. They're not idiots, presumably,
No.
right? It's smart people. It's just the role. That's what makes the experiment so persuasive. The role is so powerful, right? That it has this impact. Here it's very dramatic. Maybe in other situations it might be a little bit more insidious, but the roles are powerful, right?
And the allure of power is also corrosive.
In the or being cast in the role of the powerless
Yeah.
becomes its own I don't even know what the right word for that is. It's hard to come up with it, isn't it?
Well, we said learned helplessness,
Yeah,
earlier,
learn
but
help.
like,
It's your own learned helplessness, but like you begin to like be affected, be worn into the grooves of that role,
yeah.
right? The disempowerment becomes infectious in a way, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, tragically. So I mean that's part of the if we're playing this game, which I'm interested in doing for sure. I think you are too, this whole thing of like we can think about in the context of like subgroup cult psychology. That's an important subject matter for the now, but it also fits into ideas of like what happens to people when they're put into these kinds of boxes, right? All of a sudden the box is pretty strong, you know, which I think got to the other thing I just wanted to bring up kind of briefly in this, for people to think about. When and I do this sometimes in classes that I teach on psychology for people who are in the Chinese medical world. In like the sociology world, there's this sort of idea of functionalism versus what you might call dysfunctionalism, right? The idea that sometimes when people think about roles, they think about how they fit together, and they'll be like the different roles within a group or within the society at large will fit together like the individual parts of an organism or something, right? They all kind of play the parts and fit together. And that's a very positive framing of things. And that goes back to a guy named Talcott Parsons in the United States is one of the big people to talk about this idea. So we're going to look at it from other perspectives too, because we're going to look at some great sociologists in upcoming episodes. Um, but like this Talcott Parsons, famous American sociologist, his student was a guy named Harold Garfinkel. Some people point out the fact that he was a Jewish guy, and that maybe made them look at things a little bit different because would have been more exposed to things that would be anti-Semitism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the idea was that he started saying, well, and you can imagine other people who are from like groups that could have been discriminated against could have a similar reaction. It's like, okay, yeah, you're saying all this stuff is functional, but a lot of this shit's dysfunctional. I might get a role in this performance, right? All the world's a stage, but the play is badly cast. you know, um, that's Oscar Wilde.
Mm-hmm.
But my own take on it is something like all the world may be a stage, but the script sucks.
Right.
So this is the script sucks. And the guy's saying, well, look at you might have a role, but I don't want to play this role. I don't want to be the random person put into this role because this role sucks.
Nobody wants to be an NPC
Or a prisoner.
or a prisoner.
That's a shitty role.
Mm-hmm.
Great, you got a role for me? Yeah, what if that role is just crap, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real tension around like this question of roles, right? And I guess like from a psychospiritual point of view, I don't know how you feel about this, but like it raises a really interesting question about like what roles are you willing to take on or not take on? What roles are you like going to say, no, I'm not going to take on that role. I don't like that role. I'm going to resist it.
Yeah, I don't even know how much people necessarily choose. I mean, I think if the role of a parent, I think, well, I mean, I don't think I know for sure. Many parents, if they could do it again, they love their kids, but I think if they could just, hit the rewind button maybe just a little bit, it might do
Yeah.
it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I've had conversations recently with some people about that.
Yeah, and I think I've heard
This
it,
parenting thing is hard. But like, okay, go ahead.
and
I don't want
I've just heard
yeah.
it many times. They're like, if I would have known what I've known now about kids, I would have never had any. But also they would have said that nobody would have any, basically.
I'm the weird exception to that because I never wanted any and they turned out to be delightful.
Oh, okay.
So it's like kind of fuck this guy over here, meaning me. Okay, good for
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah,
Fuck you.
yeah.
But I like maybe because I had no expectations and I also didn't want the role. I knew I didn't want to do it. So I felt no identity with it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I sometimes like, we talk about different aspects of the tantra thing, right? And like
Yeah,
you can perform different aspects of your life and make it into tantric theater,
yeah,
but you have to be willing to take the role and make it into tantric theater. So I think, that's kind of maybe what the attitude that I took. But I mean, that's a really interesting question. Again, when I was throwing it out over brunch today, one of the responses I got was something like, well, people don't even really know that they're performing these roles. They don't even really ask the question or really think about it. And like the person I was talking to was trying to make some distinctions. I said something like they don't question it. And I think she was trying to go further and say, no, it doesn't even really occur to you to question it.
mm,
They're so ingrained that the thought doesn't even occur to like ask the question. She's really originally not from the States too.
mm-hmm.
So that maybe her perspective is a little bit different. But I know, what do you think about that? I mean, we talk about this idea of questioning in this podcast from the very first episode.
Yeah,
So this is kind of like our wheelhouse.
mm,
I mean, maybe it's like even pointing out to people like, hey, look at the role and ask a question and see if you're into it or not.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we've been harping this for the last several episodes, you know,
Yeah. It's a
about
kind of a, yeah,
yeah. Just, I mean, that, yeah, yeah,
total agreement.
yes,
Yeah. And like, as we go further in it, there's definitely going to be things where you can be like attacked for non-compliance, right?
For sure. Yep.
So as we shift to our idea of talking about, let's say resistance, which will be our next big subject matter,
Hmm.
there's no doubt that there's risks for being non-compliant with things,
Absolutely.
right? The social psych literature is pretty clear on that too. It's interesting, and the stuff I was looking at, they talk, again, we'll shift to resistance and dissent. So they'll, like if you do not comply, then you can, and if you're consistent in that, you can be seen as sort of like, sometimes they use the phrase competent and honest if someone is willing to resist a role.
Mm.
People have a kind of a weird potential respect for it.
Hmm.
And they'll go,
It's
okay, yeah.
it's funny you say that because I was telling a patient of mine today because we were talking about this because I talk about this a lot in general, younger guy, got a family, works really hard, but works sometimes too hard. It's almost sacrificial. It is, and he would agree. And so we talked about his upbringing a little bit, and I said, it's interesting, man. Wherever we're from, whatever culture we're from, we're told, we grow up being used to things, but it doesn't mean that we have to like those things. It doesn't mean we have to identify with those things. And people who don't identify with them often get a lot of pushback. And I said, case in point, and again, we're just talking about stuff. I said, I've been to Thailand numerous times.
Hmm.
Do you know how many lady boys are out there? Lots. And do you know how much grief they get from society? None.
Oh, yeah.
But here, oh my God, it's like the biggest thing ever. You know what I mean? Like it's like the biggest thing ever in the history of the world. Newsflash, that's because you're a bunch of fucking tight asses.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah, sure. Is there some problem with some crazy people who are not right, who are, trying to, they're lost some of their mind and their identity? I'm not saying that for everybody. I'm just saying in general, it doesn't matter. Yeah, those people are going to be a problem. Then you
But
know
like
what?
real quick on that point, we're clinicians. So if you have someone who that's the issue, that's a clinical
That's a
question.
clinical question.
That's just a
Exactly.
clinical question. That's that person having beyond the deeper whatever
Yeah.
of gender and
Yeah.
sexuality. That's an
Yeah.
individual clinical question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And with the closing of all these mental facilities in the early 2000s, where do you think all these people are going to go? They're going to flood into society. And so we have to, again, not saying everybody is a mental patient who chooses a different lifestyle.
No,
I'm just,
exactly the opposite.
yeah.
The exact opposite point. There's a difference between individual liberty and choosing what you want to do with your own life, and then some
Mhm.
people are going to have issues,
Yes,
right?
we're going to
That's
have
like,
issues.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
my
Mhm.
point of bringing it up to him is that, like, look at what happens when people question binary choice.
Yeah.
When people question their roles when they don't want to fit in, then what happens? It's it's very common to say, "Oh, the pink-haired college liberal," as like this sort of pejorative description for a group of, kids who are in college. And it's pejorative because they're making fun of them for A, having pink hair. Okay, fine. B, being compassionate and overly sensitive, and C, getting an education. Right? They're smart because they're getting schooling, but they're stupid because they make quote unquote dumb choices while they're there. But they're also questioning. They're questioning the status quo, and people don't like that. So the
Yeah.
role that you've taken on is holding up the status quo. Is that what you want to do? Is that your actual choice? Did you sign up for that when you were a kid? You said, "I want to maintain the status quo." Yay. And so I told him this, and I said, the people who get remembered in history are not good boys and good girls. They're not. They're the ones that ask the questions. They're the ones that stand up and are willing to be different. Those people get remembered. So for all the people's egos who want to be inflated and being remembered in the annals of history, just remember the people who fit in die unremembered.
Yeah. It's funny because they had that point in the social psych book. They had a whole paragraph about that. The people who are, you know, um, resisting are not always the ones who are going to be liked, because there's a definite like social psychology. The research does say like, you're probably going to be disliked on some level,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you're challenging something. And then when we get to like the sociology stuff that we're going to do under things like social cohesion, especially, you can see where there's another take on this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's right. This whole idea of, it takes a certain courage to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there'll be some kind of sometimes some strange begrudging respect that will mix with hostility, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like thinking about my own childhood. I was talking with my brother today, and studying all this stuff, the sociology and the social psychology stuff has been interesting because I flash back and I grew up in what you would call MAGA America. Like I grew up in Trump's America. I understand it from a very particular vantage point because I
Oh,
grew up
you mean
under.
upper class New York?
I wasn't amongst the real estate developers. I was amongst the people who were like the lower middle class, upper lower class white folk. And I could never fit into those groups, right?
Yeah.
And my best friend was a dude who was Greek, and his complexion was just darker. He was Greek, and we had a lot of fights. And I look back on this, and it was like, okay, we were just willing to be different, and it was funny. Every little thing where we learn these things, like sometimes you flash back through your life, and hopefully this happens for other people too.
Mm,
But I flashed back, and I was like, yeah, when I look back, and there was like kind of a begrudging respect, and then like this hostility. So
mm,
you got both of these things. There were people who would be like, they'd come up and they'd show respect, because there is something that people can respect that, if you do like if you're patient, if he decides, okay, I'm gonna take a stand on certain things I don't like,
mm,
like it may be the case that people will go, okay, I respect this. And that you will go up in their opinion, but of course there'll be other people who will, show that hostility.
right.
Okay, before we totally end it, I guess we should probably this will be our one little nod to like news of the day, but it's a deeper question than just that, I think. And I was curious of your opinion.
Sure.
So the particular news of the day is that under our current administration, we're April 2025, it's hard to know what's happening, but they're going in without clear identification that they're ICE agents. They just go in
Oh
like
yeah.
kind of undercover. And the weirdest one that happened was they refused to show ID.
Yeah.
So they were arresting this dude in the courthouse, and the people around him, and I don't even know if they were bystanders or people who knew him, they might have just been bystanders. And they stepped up and they said, well, who are you exactly?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, like, we're not going to show ID. And they refused to do it. The one guy was wearing, is it a
But
balaclava?
yeah.
Yeah, he's wearing like a mask. The other dude looked like he'd be like waiting in line to try to buy like a bootleg ticket for fish or something like that. He had like a
Mm-hmm.
man bun. It's an older looking dude, ponytail, man bun guy, and you're like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
untucked shirt. Some dudes just come walking up to you. One guy in a mask, the other dude looking like, pulled his shirt out because he's on his way to the Grateful Dead concert or something like that. And you're like, okay, who are these people? So they just came up and they started like trying to take this guy away. And there was a couple of women there who kind of stepped in and said, well, who are you? Can you show some ID? And they refused.
Mm-hmm.
And the one guy kept saying, you know, don't stand in the way of me doing my legal responsibilities. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. And he kept saying this over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they took the guy away. They pushed the woman out of the way. She tried to get between them. And okay, so the capper on the end of the story is that they're filing charges against those bystanders, and they're going to like charge them with like interfering with, you know, the activities of a law officer or whatever the official charge would be or something.
Mm.
And I was looking at that and I was going, okay, that's fucked up on all kinds of levels. Obviously, we can all think that. But relative to this, the Stanford Prison Experiment, like who are these people? And it got to be the point of like, are they just deputizing people to do stuff? Because they didn't, I mean, who are they? Right. And so, got to the idea that the minute you put someone in the role of that authority, everything in the Stanford Prison Experiment says that they're going to potentially really abuse that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's like immediately follows from like the social facts of the situation that the thing can immediately like deteriorate into, violence and abuse. Right. So, anyways, I thought I'd get your like, brief opinion on it. It was so bizarre that they wouldn't show ID and they wouldn't self-identify. So, I mean, what do you make out of that?
Mm.
And it's going to
Well,
go to a situation like, okay, if the whole idea is that we're also, because the thing I was listening to about it is I was thinking, well, maybe we're just deputizing people. But like, if you're not trained, I mean, you have to get trained to even function in that role, right? Otherwise, you get all the worst parts of the Stanford prison experiment potentially coming out,
that's a
just to make the point,
that's a
right?
good. I mean, that's a very deeply psychological and intellectual argument to make there, Eric. So very nice, very nice to
I
bring that
think it's
home.
like that's what they're trying to show.
I'm gonna go regulatory, and I'm going to say that the ICE falls under the Department of Homeland Security, DHS,
That's
which
what he's
was
identifying himself as in the video that I saw. Yeah, this dude.
well, which it was, let's say, an outpouring or an eruption, like a pimple
Mhm.
from the Patriot Act.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hmm.
So
So that's old school, like Iraq War period, 9/11.
9/11, yeah, yeah. So 9
Like those are 9/11 governmental
9/11
acts.
governmental
Yeah,
organizations that were created,
yeah,
that sort of are not constitutional, but were brought about as a yielding of power from the people to the government in order to better secure us or whatever. And when they're not used in a predatory way, they don't serve a huge function. They're another organization, right? And they do whatever they do. Okay, they're Homeland Security, whatever that means. I don't. So what the FBI and the CIA that what they're just we need another
yeah,
department. Got it. If we're looking to cut stuff, I could find places to cut, you know.
yeah.
But we're not going to cut that because that's
Well,
has nefarious.
that budget's going up.
That budget's going up for sure.
Yeah,
Meals on Wheels going down, but that budget's going up.
yeah,
Okay. So the problem is that when you cede your freedom, right, over to the authority. And now keep in mind that was a Republican administration, and since then there was another 8 years of Democratic administration, then 4 years of Republican administration, then 4 years of Democratic, administration, and now we're another. Nobody presses to change what was at once a sort of a wartime, short-lived need, reactionary need based on what happened at 9/11. And the kind of argument is going to say, well, we don't know when another one's going to happen, so we have to keep it in place. Okay, then this also occurs because now you can take those methods of, we'll call them safety, right? Which I say sarcastically for those who are listening. Uh, and those measures of safety quickly become the measures of control and then the measures of enforcement. Enforcement of what? Oh, I don't know. Depends on what you want to enforce. Because now you fall outside of the jurisdiction of, wherever all the, habeas corpus, jurisprudence, all these kind of, right? Because they don't fall in those things. And so people who are, whether you agree with them or don't agree with them, are very well adept in understanding all the various laws that are on the books and which ones can be used in this purpose. Even if you think that this is nefarious, they know what they're doing. They look it up. They spend time studying and learning this. And so they pick and choose the things they want and then implement it. But the larger point is that when you cede control, and you don't fight to get it back, this is what happens.
it's funny with the Patriot Act, but there's always been this conversation, and you and I, we don't talk about politics on the podcast, but we pay attention to what's happening in the
Yeah.
world. In a certain sense, I think we both think a little bit that you have a spiritual responsibility to do so,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a little bit something like that,
Yeah.
right? And we talked about that a little bit last episode, like a couple of the spiritual figures I really admire, Hosokawa Roshi, Gelik Rinpoche, being people who tried to pay attention to what was happening in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's always been this concern about the Patriot Act, it being abused at the time too. Guantanamo being like, okay, right, and these black
Still open, by
nights.
the way.
Yeah, it's still open. Made it through the whole Obama administration, just to be honest about it. But there always was this whole fear of what happens if you get like someone who's a political leader who just declares everything an emergency, right? And all of a sudden, all these powers kick in, right?
Mm-hmm.
How irresponsible that's been, right? Yeah. All right, yeah, thanks for all that. I went into like the thing like we're so deep in the social psychology of this that I was saying, okay, there's a social psychology piece to this. If you all of a sudden deputize a bunch of people,
Mm-hmm.
you're putting them in the role of the guards.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious what you thought about that too, because I mean, we've been around each other for, how long we know each other? A decade or more now, right?
More, probably
Yeah.
by more like 13.
But like, you were in the military and like
Mm-hmm.
I was never in the military, but I think one of the things that happens in the military is you have to train people
Yes.
to take a role or to train people how to exercise a role responsibly, right? Because, a soldier is a role associated with potential violence, obviously. It's part of the
Mm-hmm.
role, but you learn how to control.
Correct.
Part of the training is to control the violent parts of the role so you handle it responsibly. If you don't really train people in those ways, even the Stanford prison thing says you're going to bring out potentially dark people if you put them in the dark aspects of people if you put them in a dark role,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Or be careful the roles you create because you're going to elicit things out of those roles.
Mm-hmm.
But I was like the whole idea that like I mean, if you start looking at the training behind these folks, what is it so that people can learn how to handle the
Correct.
darker parts of those roles? So I was just curious
Correct.
what you thought about that, someone who was trained as a soldier, because you have to learn how to control aggression and violence and use it in the right way appropriate to that role, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes, sometimes experience does that, and sometimes the training does.
Okay, you learn both ways, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You can never, no, nobody can train you for every situation. It's not, you know.
One of the dudes I was listening to about this particular thing was like, if someone comes up, someone sent, it's a podcast thing I listen to. We'll have to talk about the details of it. But the guy was basically they got someone like kind of writing into their show and said, my wife is a green card holder. And if some dudes came up in like balaclavas and no identification, and they just started trying to take her off the street, would I let them do that? I think not.
No.
And he said, I have a concealed carry permit.
Correct.
I think that weapon would come out in that circumstance, you know?
Very likely.
And then you're getting to situations where, even you put someone in the role of prisoner or, you know, an authority thing like this, we may not like the role in a lot of ways, but you're putting people into those roles where you're putting them in danger, actually.
You are
Right? Because
because
eventually you're gonna get no identification, no nothing. You just come up,
you come
or you're
up.
putting people like who the fuck's to say that someone doesn't just decide that we're just going to start taking people off the street? We've had
Um,
this kind of vigilante kind of shit before in the United States, and people have gotten killed around these
yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
it's
dangerous.
dangerous.
It's dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous for the even for the people who are doing it.
Yeah,
You know, this is why you don't really see it in places that have very loose laws about concealed carry. You just don't. You don't because you don't know. You don't know who you don't know, and you run up. I don't know.
that's true. You don't want to go into like you go into this certain neighborhood. You're like, I'm not going to just like jump some person randomly.
No, it just yeah. But anywho's
Someone else. Yeah, yeah. And it
yeah.
was like, it's like it's fit so well into the Stanford. I was just watching the video,
Agreed. Yeah.
and I was just like, man, they're arresting these bystanders, but the bystanders are like, I don't know who you are. And then
Hmm.
what the Stanford Prison Experiment says, the Zimbardo experiment is like, man, you get real abuse of power here,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's just, yeah, go ahead, yeah,
Without proper training, without
yeah,
proper you know, ability to manage your emotions, it can go awry for sure.
and like proper expectations of how people are supposed to handle these things and behave.
Mm-hmm.
If the role's dark
Mm-hmm.
or can cap into dark places, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it fit into the conversation. So
Yeah.
yeah,
No, it's good. That was
yeah,
good.
yeah.
That was
All
good.
right. Well, I wish we could end on a more positive note. The positive note is probably like for all of us, what I take is like a take home message of like this whole thing would be like, and again, I've had conversations with people I deeply love about this. Look at the roles that you're taking on.
Sure.
And like, if anything, hopefully this helps define what this is. Look at the roles that you're voluntarily taking on and
Hmm.
saying, okay, do I want this role? Do I not want this role? And maybe use that functional versus dysfunctional thing if that helps as a tool say, okay, what aspects of this role do I really think are functional? They're good.
Right.
And what aspects of this role do I think are dysfunctional?
Mm-hmm.
And like maybe that's a kind of a, like we talk about Manjushri's blade sometimes, right? In Buddhism, like the bodhisattva of wisdom carries a sword, and it's like to help you cut through the wrong ideas.
Yeah.
So maybe that's, that kind of thinking ends up being kind of a tool, a kind
Mm,
of a sword you can use to start going, okay, what are the aspects of the, not even on a personal level, but what are the aspects of the role that are problematic? I got
yeah.
to say one more thing about this. When I talk about this with students in classes now, and I've gotten more conscious about this, there's definitely conversations in the culture which are good about like my childhood trauma is the source of things.
Right.
And we're cool with that on this podcast. We did a whole thing about attachment theory that all relates back to childhood trauma and, potentially. But this is the problem of role, right? It's the other set of questions that you like have to really think about,
Mm,
if you want to spiritually free yourself. So, maybe this Zimbardo experiment says, okay, roles are powerful. We've just shown it to you, right? We take random people, we put them into things, the role takes them over. Roles are powerful, right? Okay, so point number one. Point number two. Okay, now we can question, do I want this role? Do I not want this role? Or what aspects of this role do I want or not want? I think maybe that's a more positive way to end things.
sounds good to me.
Okay, you're cool with it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Awesome, Eric. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening experience today.
Yeah.
One that is, certainly a nice capper for where we've been so far.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
And we'll continue to get into this topic as we're in the semester of social psychology in this podcast that we're in right now.
Cult psychology. Next
Yeah.
episode, descent.
Yes. So
Yeah, a little bit on descent. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. But thank you as always, audience. Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe, whatever platform you're on, whatever you like. It definitely helps the podcast to grow and, help our message reach more folks. And if you got some love or some hate, leave comments or send us an email at ginandtantra@gmail.com. Hit us up on the gram, the Gin and Tantra podcast. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.